Hello all, and welcome back to the Potted Plant Politics YouTube channel. And in today's video, I am going to take 3 proposals put forward by Zia Yusuf and Reform on illegal migration, and I'm going to take each argument and give my opinion on it. I'm also gonna use evidence where applicable, and I will try my best to represent reform's strongest points and give them the best defense possible. But ultimately, I'm gonna rip into their arguments and show everybody watching that their arguments are essentially piles of shit and they don't actually know what they're talking about when it comes to most of their policies. In my opinion, of course.
To help us do that. We will also ensure that they will never, so if you are in the country illegally or you came to the country illegally, you will have no ability to appeal based on the merits of your asylum claim, because your asylum claim will be rendered null and void by virtue of the fact that you came to Britain illegally, which is what should be the case given the Immigration Act of 1971. It's just that, as I said, Tory and Labour governments have just decided not to enforce that, okay? But to answer your question...
So, I would like to differentiate between the method of entry a immigrant takes to come to this country and whether their asylum claim is valid. Because I do not think that someone's method of entry should be a determinant of whether the asylum claim is granted or not. I think an asylum claim should be case based. Here's why. According to the Oxford Immigration Observatory, roughly 93% of small boat arrivals between 2018 and 2025 claimed asylum, and around 60% of those claims were substantively decided claims resulted in protection. So let me ask you this: is it reasonable to say that no matter how somebody enters, they still might have a serious problem? Because the previous system certainly decided they did, granting over 60% of those claims and leaving 33% rejected. So I personally think it's reasonable to assume that the majority of those people on small boats either had reasonable claims or were coming from dangerous circumstances that granted them the reasonable claim, because these claims aren't taken lightly. I won't pretend that I understand the whole process, but I do know they don't just turn up handing out passports and papers. So these people must have had serious reasons to be granted asylum. And Reform's stance on the small boats issue would completely remove the ability for anyone to defend that claim if they've come illegally. So surely you can see the problems that's raising there and the moral implications. And there is evidence suggesting it is not even a growing problem. According to the Oxford Immigration Observatory, in the first 7 months of 2026, around 14,200 people arrived by small boat. Now, that may seem like a big number, but just for context, that is 44% fewer than in 2025. Now, to be fair to Reform, the counter argument is allowing small boat crossings creates incentives for immigrants to go on these dangerous journeys across large amounts of open waters across the English Channel. And it also provides people smugglers with something to, to sell. Therefore, Reform's argument is that creating a stronger deterrent stops people from coming to the country in the first place and taking those dangerous risks. Basically, if you enter illegally, you will be removed. But a deterrent still has to have actionable steps. And it still requires some way to legally and practically return the people to around 1,100 people were returned to France between September 2025 and June 2026, only 4% of small boat arrivals during that period. So, only small amounts of the immigrants are actually being returned to France under the current regime. And those agreements to return them to France come with complex decision-making processes and agreements between Britain and France. I'm not claiming to be an international law expert, but surely if you add large amounts more to that agreement, say if you try to return 5,000 people or 10,000 people, France might not agree to that, and then they might refuse to have them back. What do you do then? Do you just give them back anyway? Because that's not gonna go down well. But that's okay, because at least we're stopping the people smugglers. And I'd say, yes, you might stop a few, or the majority, but what's to say some of them won't just go, alright then, I'll change my routes. Not eliminating the problem, just using a different crossing or a different method. Now, it's important to state here that I am not arguing for open borders or against removal of illegal migrants. I am simply saying if somebody crosses illegally, they might still have a problem worth considering. And if they go through all the legal processes, which they should be allowed under the Human Rights Act, then if by the end of that process they don't have a valid asylum claim, then remove them, then send them back to France. I'm just saying everybody should be given a chance, regardless of the method of entry.
Okay, so in terms of costs, so we estimate the total cost ramped over a period of time for incremental enforcement resource to be in the region of 400 to 500 million. However, as I said, again, a lot of this has been modelled off what the FCA does and financial crime. So just as the FCA gets to keep the proceeds of enforcement actions that it generates, we would do the same with this. So we actually expect broadly the cost, this policy to be cost neutral, just given the gargantuan.
Point 2. The next claim I would like to challenge is that in reform claims, enforcement of penalties on illegal migrant workers in the UK could cost anywhere from 400 to 500 million. Now, I'm not disputing whether that figure is correct. I'm disputing whether it could be cost neutral, as Yusuf and Reform claims it could be. Now, in 2025, the Home Office issued 2,438 penalties worth approximately 130 million pounds. I have done some calculations using the raw data set I have used for this research, and I have come to the conclusion that each case is worth an average of £49,800. My calculations plus the initial data set will be down in the description. So let's take the lower end of the 400 to 500 million. So how many cases would they need per year to reach that 400 million they are spending on the policy? Now, drum roll please. That is equal to approximately 8,000 cases a year. Roughly 3 times the amount given out now. And it gets even better, because that is assuming 100% collection rate, which is not really realistic, as the Home Office themselves say that is the total gross value of the penalties if they are all claimed, but claims can be disputed, postponed, and there might be difficulties collecting them because of appeals and objections. So, let's still be generous to Reform. Let's assume maybe if they don't get the 100% success rate, let's only assume that it drops by 10% to 90%. You know, be fair to Reform, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. Let's assume that the middle scenario is 90%, and then the number of cases increases to 9,000. But that's not enough. Let's say reforms absolutely worst scenario they could ever imagine happened, but let's still give them a pretty generous success rate of 80% if the absolute worst happens. At 80%, the number of cases they would need equals 10,000. More accurate figures and more specific numbers will be included in the PDF in the description, but these numbers are accurate, they're just rounded down. So, my percentages I have worked at have been pretty accurate towards reform. They've been quite pro-reform, to be honest, because I can't imagine the actual success rate will be anywhere near 80%. And I've put 80% as the worst possible efficiency they could be to be generous to reform. And even if it works out really good for reform, they still have to have 8,000 cases at absolute maximum efficiency to even achieve the 400 million. Now, reform's defence could be, well, Evan, actually, you're going off the current limit on fines and the current average amount of fines given out per value. And I'd say, okay, fair enough, if you want to up the maximum amount, which is currently 60,000, you can give out per migrant worker. That's the maximum according to Home Office statistics. Let's say they want to up that, so you can hand out £100,000 per worker, and in some cases 10% of global turnover. Right? Let's give them that. They can have bigger fines all they want, I don't care. But what they've got to take into consideration is the ability for big conglomerate type companies to move the majority of their base of operations outside the UK and their ability to then take all their investments from the UK and place it into a different country with lesser fines. But you're thinking, okay, but what about the SMEs? The small medium enterprises? Well, they might not be able to afford these fines, which may lead to insolvency or administration, which then would leave lots of employees out of jobs. They might not be able to pay the redundancy packages for those in place, which then would put more stress on government assets because they might have to pay those redundancy packages. So essentially what I'm saying is small to medium enterprises might go insolvent and not be able to pay the fines, and then the big conglomerates or even just the big international companies may take their investments out the UK, may cut a load of jobs off their balance sheets, which may affect British born citizens, and in extreme cases they might even move their entire base of operations.
And Chris from the Press Association.
Thanks, Chris McKeon, PA. I also wanted to ask about Monday's announcement, given that we know the Royal Navy struggles to meet its existing commitments, and the offshore patrol vessels you're thinking of using already have a lot to do defending Britain from Russian activity around our waters, protecting fisheries, protecting the Falklands, a few other things. So, specifically, which of the Navy's existing commitments are you thinking of abandoning or scaling back in order to implement this policy?
Okay. Really easy way to answer that question. Again, I'm fascinated to see that there are many, particularly in the establishment talking heads saying, oh, you know, our Navy's has already got a lot to do. My response is simple. What could be more important a mission for His Majesty's Royal Navy than preserving the borders of the United Kingdom? I can't think of one. And so, you know...
Point 3. Zia Yusuf's argument is that reforms Operation Fortress would use military assistance, including Navy vessels and Royal Marines, to intercept small boats in the Channel, transfer the occupants, and return them back to France or towards France. My objection to this isn't that the Royal Navy couldn't do this, because they objectively could, but my objection to this comes from a fundamental economic question, which is resource allocation when there are finite resources involved. When Britain's military already has substantial military commitments, this is fundamentally an opportunity cost question. The defence commitments outlined in the 2025 Strategic Defence Review describes a security environment more dangerous and unpredictable than any point since the Cold War. And it calls for war fighting readiness and a NATO-first approach. Its commitments include £15 billion for the Sovereign Warhead Programme, a further £6 million for munitions, and up to £1 billion for homeland, air and missile defences, alongside other commitments such as submarine, cyber, RAF, army, etc. Now, let me talk to you about a concept called allocative efficiency. Allocative efficiency is an economic theory where resources that are scarce have alternative resources. It's fundamentally different to opportunity cost, because opportunity cost is about production. Allocative efficiency is about allocating existing resources. So, if I was to ask you this, would you rather our Royal Navy continue its operations in Russia, Ukraine, in the Middle East, or would you rather them be possibly taken away from those rather important geopolitical and NATO security first operations, and come back to stop a bunch of people in rubber dinghies, pretty much? I don't know about you, but I think that's a pretty poor use of existing resources to pull them out of serious conflicts, potentially to then move them to something that there's no immediate danger to our sovereign borders by then these immigrants coming over. They're not coming over with submachine guns and all that. No immigrant is coming over with the nuclear bomb going, I'm going to blow up the UK, are they? Not really. Whereas Russia genuinely have threatened Europe and threatened the UK in the past, so I'd rather our submarines stay over there, and I'd rather us continue allocating resources to those areas, because those areas are vastly more important, because after all, there wouldn't be an immigration problem if there wasn't a world where the UK didn't exist, because it's been blown off the world by a Russian nuclear bomb, you know? So in my opinion, NATO first approach is better use of our military than this home sovereign plan project Fortress would have. Because at the end of the day, these immigrants, they're just people, really. They're not highly dangerous nuclear weapons. Or they're not threatening to invade half of Europe. Now, in Reform's defence, Britain's defence budget itself is increasing. The government are committed to 2.5% of GDP from April 2027, with an ambition to reach 3% in the next Parliament when fiscal rules and economic conditions allow for it. Therefore, Reform could reasonably say, well, we wouldn't have to remove anything, we just add to the commitments because we've got more budget for it. And I'd say, yeah, okay, but that doesn't exactly remove opportunity cost, does it? Like, that extra money could go more on cyber submarines, the RAF, etc., rather than doing all this nonsense trying to stop people in rubber dinghies. Because essentially, having bigger budgets does not mean we can automatically spend it on new things. It might be better spent on existing things, or creating an entirely new part or system that we need, or something like that. Essentially, a bigger budget does not remove opportunity costs and allocative efficiency. So ultimately, these are the three problems with Reform's proposals. Removing the ability to challenge a removal of the asylum claim based on method of entry is, in my opinion, fundamentally wrong, as I believe that people who enter the country illegally can still have serious problems and serious reasons for wanting to come to this country. The claim that enforcement on illegal working in the UK could be broadly cost neutral is also wildly stupid and idiotic. Operation Fortress, seriously, who came up with the idea of using significant military resources to stop people in rubber dinghies should be fired, because that is possibly the stupidest allocation of resources I've ever heard of. But what's important to note in this video is I have personally tried my best to give Reform their strongest counter argument, because we must remember, at the end of the day, they're not here to defend themselves. They didn't ask me to make this video on them, so they weren't properly prepared to defend themselves. And it's also important to note that I myself personally are not arguing that immigration isn't a real problem that needs addressing, because in some cases it is. I'm just advocating for fair opportunities on behalf of asylum claims and claimants. But do I still fundamentally disagree with Zia Yusuf, Nigel Farage and Reform? Yes. Do I think they're all dickheads? Yes. Will I concede that immigration is a serious problem? Partly. And does the evidence back me up? Yes. With two caveats. One, this is my argument for my particular research. And two, this isn't research done by a third neutral party. This is my targeted research. Well, it's not all my research, because I didn't write the papers, but I did target the research with one objective in mind, to disprove reform. But did I also find evidence that they might have been right? In some cases, yeah, and I tried my best to include that. But the evidence I found for my argument does substantially back me up. And I hope you listened and understood my logic. May or may not come to agree with me, but that's okay. Because this is politics at the end of the day. Nobody agrees with each other. Okay, bye all.